Good morning and welcome to the webinar. I'm your moderator, Brandon Laws. I'm the Director of Marketing at Xenium. And today's topic is taking ownership, how to create a culture of accountability in the workplace. Kelley is our speaker. Before I do a quick introduction for Molly, I wanted to just kind of run over some housekeeping items. Today's webinar is a 45-minute presentation, and then we'll do 15 minutes of Q&A on the back end, so we'll answer all your questions that you have. And regarding that, enter your questions in the chat window. I'll be monitoring while Molly's talking, and we'll address your questions at the very end. People always ask, are the slides and recording available? And absolutely yes. So after the session's over, about 24 to 48 hours after I sort of put together the recording, I'll get the slides together and I'll send you that in an email. So if you have to jump off halfway through the webinar, you can definitely expect to see the full recording. So no problem there. This webinar gets one HRCI credit for the attendees. So email me directly at brandon.laws@xeniumhr and you can get a certificate. I'll try to get those back as soon as I possibly can. And then lastly, if you want to get alerted on all of our events, webinars, new content, podcasts, go to xeniumhr.com, scroll about halfway through the homepage. There's this little subscribe button, put your email address in there, and then you'll get alerted first of all new things. Our events have been filling up pretty fast lately, so definitely subscribing is probably the best way, because a lot of times if we start marketing in on social media or other networks, a lot of times the events have been kind of filled up, so just be aware of that. Now to Molly. Molly is a senior HR business partner at Xenium. She has been here about 9 years or so. She works with very small and medium-sized businesses across many industries. Actually has a pretty good focus on nonprofits as well. And then she's a trainer for a lot of Xenium clients and guests. Hosts many of the workshops that if you've ever been to a workshop here at Xenium, she hosts and presents at a lot of those, and does a lot of on-site training as well. She's an avid reader, lifelong learner. She frequents hbr.org and is an NPR superfan, as I like to call her. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Molly.
That's been a key request from client after client that I've worked with lately. Is help my employees talk directly to one another about their performance concerns. Managers are often telling us, hey, it doesn't always have to come to me, all these issues. I'm happy to be a problem solver, but if they would just talk to each other. So I kind of see that as the next step that we'll be following up with is sort of how to facilitate those accountable conversations between folks. But whatever the nexus that brought us here, this topic of accountability, and particularly the phrase personal accountability, has become almost as much of a hot topic in the business world as the word culture. My colleagues and I are spending a lot of time mediating conflicts between employees, within teams, between managers and their employees, when the common themes tend to be a lack of ownership, responsibility, and accountability. That comes up as a central theme over and over again. Brandon can attest, we filled up this webinar in record time with a wait list even. So the topic is obviously of interest to a lot of different organizations. That said, my observation is that as much as we are attracted to the idea of increased accountability for others, we sometimes flinch at the idea of a light of accountability shining on ourselves. Surveys reveal that 80% of people see the concept of accountability in a business setting as corrective action or disciplinary or punitive. If I'm a business owner, leader, or manager, and I say to you, all right, I really need to hold my team to a higher standard of accountability, there's this sense that I'm setting out to write people up. Heads will roll, right? So that leaves many of us in kind of this complicated love-hate relationship with accountability. Typically, we want higher accountability for those around us, but we cower in fear when we hear that others are requesting greater accountability for us. So the why behind this. A recent study of over 1,000 employees found the following gaps, which I found really interesting and wanted to share with you. Big picture contributions and the accountability for the business goals was missing for individual performers. So only 43% of these workers, these employees that were surveyed at all levels of the organization, say that they felt accountable for the company's revenue, profit, or growth. 43%. And I think, managers perceive this amongst their employees as well, and that creates some definite friction. Secondly, we're not leading by example. So just 26% of employees strongly agree that managers themselves embody the values they expect from their employees. Just 26%. So in other words, my manager's asking me to do something that they themselves are not doing. Only 39% say their managers understand their role as a manager in the company. And only 40% strongly feel their managers understand their company's strategy or goals. That's pretty alarming as well. So thirdly, collaboration across teams is an issue. Just 27% of employees strongly feel they can depend on outsiders to fulfill their duties when they're working with other groups. So there's a lot of emphasis on collaboration and teamwork and getting rid of silos. Honestly, I read this statistic, this 27% of employees feeling like they can rely on others. And the first thing I thought of, I was thrown back to every high school group project I've ever worked on, where roles and responsibilities were established within minutes. And there was always a role or two for the unofficial slacker, whom we knew wasn't going to pull their weight on the project. Apparently, the halls of high school aren't that far removed from all of us now, and this impact of slackers, real or perceived, is still out there. And we don't necessarily trust that our coworkers are going to come through for us. And yes, I did go to a politically based image here because we're seeing this discussion of accountability on a national level too. So it's everywhere. It's everywhere. So moving along, we'll look at some more of these statistics. This info comes from a great study done by the Partners in Leadership Group, who conducted a 2014 workplace accountability study. And in their words, and I quote, "Many leaders are unaware their teams or organizations don't clearly understand their targeted results. This explains missed execution because of confused priorities and diluted focus, a lack of personal ownership and accountability for strategic organizational imperatives, and a lack of traction to accelerate progress on company-wide initiatives." So the key concept there is low accountability leads to mistrust, leads to low morale, leads to employee devaluation, leads to low engagement from those employees, leads to low productivity. Pretty negative chain of events there. So there's a really key word in that statement that I really want you guys to be aware of, the mistrust piece. Trust is something that comes up quite commonly in this discussion. The two most commonly cited organizational problems are from employees and managers altogether, a lack of trust, number one, and a lack of communication. So if you think about a relationship you have had or currently have with a colleague where there is implicit trust, so the working relationship and the productivity just flows back and forth between the two of you. You have each other's backs. And moreover, you get each other and you get how to work well with one another. You communicate well with one another, and typically you communicate frequently. That's the definition of a highly accountable partnership, where both parties are accountable to themselves but also to each other and the work itself. The flip side of that probably came to mind for quite a few of you too. So there's relationships you're picturing in your mind right now that are not going so well. And those relationships with low trust and broken communication have, in return, low accountability, right? Makes sense. So when we see companies with high positive accountability cultures, so we've got lots and lots of accountability within this culture, we see several things. We see improved performance across the board amongst both employees and leaders. I would add to that statement that companies with high accountability cultures are typically characterized by something I wish I could tap into in every company I work with, because I know they're out there, but they're not always obvious, and that is employee leaders, meaning we find cultural leadership at every level of the organization, not just amongst those with direct reports or managerial responsibilities, but you've got employees at all levels of the organization taking ownership and leading culturally. We all feel ownership then for the culture and work to demonstrate that kind of organic, spontaneous leadership as a result. And then that leads to higher employee participation and involvement. I know that not all of you are in Oregon, but many of our clients are based here, and probably you're aware of the fact that the unemployment rate dropped to a 40-year low in April here in Oregon. And I love that fact because that's actually the lowest it's been since they began keeping records. So we can honestly say unemployment is at its lowest rate, or was at least in April, that it's ever been. It is an employee's market right now. If I don't like my job or my team or my manager, I can easily go elsewhere and find something else. And we're seeing that with our clients. They're really struggling to recruit right now. So employee engagement is absolutely critical to retaining your top talent. When we have people who are engaged, they demonstrate increased feelings of competency. There's a wonderful acronym that we use in the HR world, and I think that comes, based in psychology, which is ICE, I-C-E, as in icicle or ice cube. The I stands for an individual's need for inclusion or being part of a team. The C is our control over the work and our environment. And the E is that esteem piece, or the pride in the work and that which we're working on, which is what we're honing in on here. So if we have those things where we feel included, we have the control to do the work on our own, and high trust from our managers and leaders to get it done, and that esteem that comes from a job well done, then things are really humming along, and you see that in cultures and in teams. When those and other positive factors at play, we feel an increased confidence in our abilities. It leads naturally to the employee commitment to the work at hand. Those things go hand in hand. An increased commitment means that I'm more flexible, I'm more comfortable, which leads to creativity and innovation, right? That's something a lot of companies say that they want, but then they go about constructing relationships that don't support those two things, creativity and innovation. If we have those things, all the bullet points above outlined are in play, it leads to a morale boost and a greater overall job satisfaction and deeper employee engagement. So people come to your company because they hear great things about the team and the work. More importantly, they stay because they love the team and the work. So it sounds great, right? So I didn't think I'd need to convince you all, because you're here listening to this. You obviously value accountability because you're here with me now. So we have the why, now the who, the how, and the what. So we'll be focusing on 3 critical elements in this session on the accountability piece: managers, employees, and company culture, each of which are dependent upon the others to work as a whole. So let's start with those accountable managers. Keeping in mind that statistic of an 80% unfavorable impression of accountability that folks share, and the sense that many people have of a kind of a punitive connotation around accountability, it's important to understand that managers have the most substantial impact on an employee's perception of company culture as it pertains to accountability. So the single most significant impact. We all know what happens when the idea of employee or team accountability is abused, as it is in this cartoon. It's used as a weapon or some standard that people are consistently falling short of. Accountability, or the lack thereof, becomes a joke, basically. Managers and leaders honestly do have a higher standard of accountability. Not only higher, but I would argue the highest. We set and lead by example. So if we aren't holding ourselves accountable, the whole enterprise collapses. With great power comes great responsibility. And the power in this case is the power to set the team tone. Culture is set at so many levels in a company, first and foremost through the employee's relationship with their manager, and then through the team or the department relationships, and then on out to the company as a whole. But the first and most primal relationship between employee and manager cannot be overstated in terms of its importance in influencing how we view the company as a whole. Leaders also have the greatest initial influence on company culture. So when you think about our new hires coming into our company culture, they're watching leadership in particular for cultural norms and cues on how to act. Without even realizing it, people start to internalize the environment and the social patterns around us based on what they're seeing from the leadership team and from their manager, most specifically. There was a great article in Forbes as far back as July of 2012 that kind of gets to the heart of this conversation. The author noted that, quote, "Great management can only be attained by those who are able to manage themselves before managing others." End quote. So when leaders fail in their self-management, and we all do from time to time, right, cracks begin to appear that can shake the foundation of the individual and the team relationships to their core. I see managers in this position frequently, and clearly none of them set out to fail, but it happens even amongst our great leaders. There's so much coming at us. Most of our leaders are working managers doing their own job and then also, supporting the rest of the team, we become overwhelmed, overworked, unaware, and at times inattentive. So those are the moments when it's time to come to a full stop and check in. The author of that Forbes article, Glenn Lopez, went on to note that great managers or accountable managers continually ask themselves these questions. When did your performance expectations not match the results? So when did you fall short? What could you have done differently to attain your expectations? Do you continue to enforce the missing elements in your work? So there is, in my experience, working with, senior leaders, CEOs, presidents, junior managers, line leads, and individual employees, there is so much coming at us right now in the business world, technologically, time span wise. We just are processing through so much that it's this hurry up, go, 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 we'll catch up later mentality. This process of reflection and introspection, authentic, process, if it's done well, it does take time, but it is so valuable into really kind of reflecting back on what happened and where the gap was between where I wanted to be and where I landed. So as leaders, we need to walk that walk before we can talk the talk. The process of this self-reflection needs to become second nature. And there's many leaders that I've worked with who have actually printed this out, put it on their desk, and refer to it frequently. Where did I fall short? What could I have done? And what am I going to continue to do? So what happens next? In summary, great management can only be attained by those who are able to manage themselves before managing others. Without accountability, the ability to manage doesn't exist. Great management is holding yourself and those around you accountable to deliver results. Now, I have to, of course, as an English major, put a plug in here for language. So these qualities shine through in how our leaders talk, the language we use, especially when things don't go well. So as you read these phrases to yourself, think about the different impacts each phrase would have on the team. I like to picture the head of Volkswagen in this conversation as a recent example. So Volkswagen, many of you probably know, recently settled a multi-million-dollar lawsuit when we learned that many VW cars being sold in America had what's being called a defeat device. So it's basically software in diesel engines for the diesel cars that could detect when they were being tested for environmental emissions, and in those moments change the performance accordingly to improve the results. So it's basically a cheat that was built into the car. So Michael Horn, which was VW's America's boss, said, quote, "We've totally screwed up," end quote. Meanwhile, the group's chief executive at the time, a man by the name of Martin Winterkorn, said VW had, quote unquote, broken the trust of our customers and the public. Mr. Winterkorn resigned as a direct result of the scandal and was replaced by a gentleman by the name of Matthias Mueller, who stated, quote, "My most urgent task is to win back trust for the Volkswagen Group by leaving no stone unturned." My most urgent task. Okay, what a shift in tone around ownership at the very top here. And this played out over some amount of time. So I kind of think through this and I think, which of these leaders sounds the most accountable? We've screwed up. Well, VW has broken the trust of the customers and the public. My most urgent task is to win back the trust, right? So which of these folks do you trust? Which of these folks would you want to work for, right? So language is so powerful in its ability to shape our reality and, frankly, our relationships, that we need to, as leaders, be conscious of the need to reflect on these words that we're using when things go badly. I chose this image for a reason to tee off our conversation around individual employee accountability. So we're shifting now from managers to our employees. Interestingly, a lot of the grumbling we're hearing around a lack of accountability is from Gen X managers, so Generation X managers, regarding their millennial employees. Just as an example or paraphrasing of kind of what I'm hearing from these leaders, a recent Harvard Business Review article notes that there appears to be a questioning of, quote, the work ethic and entitlement mentality of Generation Y, or millennials. The youngest members of the workforce, especially in the U.S., have grown up in a sheltered environment. They expect praise and recognition and can be indignant when it's not forthcoming. They're not particularly open to critical feedback. So that's not from me. I just want to be very careful to say that was from the Harvard Business Review article, and it's a reflection of what I'm hearing from a lot of managers. I have to note, though, that the title of this particular article is "1 out of every 2 managers is terrible at accountability." So that's not the summary of the article. Honestly, I wanted to insert this discussion in here because in my experience and from all the surveys and the studies, accountability truly is a challenge that extends beyond pure generational lines, beyond gender or job industry or title, ethnicity. I mean, basically, we all have accountability issues here and there, regardless of gender, so forth, and generation as well. At its core, it's absolutely a two-way street in that managers need to set clear expectations and hold employees accountable just as much as employees need to hold themselves accountable, right? So in that last slide, when we looked at language, put yourself back into the shoes of a manager whose direct report made a costly mistake. It's one thing to own that mistake from a leadership level, maybe when you're talking with a client or your manager or the team as a whole. But is it right and appropriate to continuously fall on your sword or tackle issues solely as a group when maybe the breakdown is within a specific person? I don't think so. I think we owe that feedback and the respect of addressing challenges head on with our employees. So how do managers hold their employees individually accountable? Firstly, we got to start with the basics of solid management. Start with clear and consistent performance expectations. We want to involve our employees in their goal setting and then get out of their way. Give them the authority to accomplish their goals. Remember that ICE, the C, is that control, to be able to do my work and control my environment. We also want to coach the employees, but encourage independence, and that's a really careful balance. We want to monitor progress toward the goals, and don't do this as a last-minute panic prior to your annual review date. That's when we seem to all revisit these goals. No, this should really be episodic, consistent check-ins, ideally monthly. We want to provide training and resources needed to do the work, and we want to establish a framework for independent problem solving. So in a couple of our trainings, we've referenced something called the GROW model, which we can share with these attendees as well, all of you. The GROW model is a really great model for asking a lot of those same kind of introspective questions around problem solving. And we can essentially share that with our employees and encourage them to think for themselves. We also want, once they're doing that, and many are already, recognize those employees for their positive performance, both formally and informally. With a chronically low achiever who demonstrates a lack of accountability, so if we have an accountability gap or an issue with accountability with one of our employees, we want to think about working with them to develop an accountability checklist. I've included an example here. And we want to, of course, customize, though, to what makes sense for their work and their role. This is actually a model that many teachers have started to use to encourage high school and college students to develop their own personal accountability skill set. It requires time and authentic reflection. And as a manager, you can dialogue through this with an employee at a very high level to help them internalize these self-checks. But we really are hoping that they're leading the effort, that this becomes part of their process. Did I regulate my procrastination, my distractions, my temptations? Did I make good use of my resources? I mean, these are great questions that we could all be asking ourselves. And in this case, the trick is really getting the teammate to internalize it. It's going to take consistent use of this tool for it to become a habit for the employee. So all of these self-checks absolutely need to be reinforced from a company culture perspective. If we have a company culture full of finger-pointing, lack of trust, blame game, victimhood, overall low accountability, then honestly, the most driven and responsible employee or leader will fail, right? It's impossible for a plant to bloom in the absence of sunlight and water. Culture, in my mind, is what permeates the very atmosphere around us, and it influences our ability to rise to our greatest potential, to be our best, or fail, to thrive. So the company culture piece is really critical, even if we're doing all of this self-work and, leading in a great way and having these checks and balances internally. If it's then killed by the culture, we've got a problem. Love this quote. Accountability means people can count on one another to keep performance commitments and communication agreements. So what this gets at is that broader commitment across the company, not just from manager to employee or employee internal accountability as well. So strategies to build accountable teams. This is a really critical piece of this. Accountable teams and cultures don't happen overnight. We would like to have them grow organically. I've seen it happen occasionally here and there, and it's usually in the presence of great leaders and great hires. I also, unfortunately, have seen them spring up and then die on the vine. So if they're not daily nurtured, they fail. So, of course, we model accountability, collaboration, and trust within your leadership team. There's a great book, Smart Trust, that we can reference in our materials if it's not already there, that gets at the importance of productivity in how productivity will thrive in a high-trust environment. Low trust environments slow down that productivity significantly. And we all know what it feels like from an emotional level. Let's take the productivity piece out of that when we have that lack of trust, as I mentioned earlier. Authentic conversations where that feedback around what we're observing at all levels should be encouraged. And the dialogue should be healthy and solutions oriented. So essentially, that's the piece I was mentioning to you before. The next step is then, training our teams on how to have these conversations with each other. So it's not always beholden to the managers or senior leaders to foster this kind of direct, this is what I'm seeing, here's the disconnect, here's the impact upon me, what can we do to fix this conversation? Engaging in the conversations builds trust, and trust will then be the foundation for the people, that need to admit to moments when they weren't accountable. And all of us have moments like that, as well as building the teamwork that reinforces those shining moments of high ownership. We need to establish and clarify expectations. So this really varies from company to company. There's often different buzzwords used for what this looks like. It could be company values or company agreements, principles, things like that. I'm just going to use my own culture because that's what I'm most familiar with. At Xenium, we have something that we call the Xenium Promise, which was created and continues to be fostered by employees, something that every new hire is introduced to upon hire. And it includes a company-wide individual commitment to things like, I will take ownership for my success. I will speak openly and sincerely. I will be a source of inspiration. I will develop and foster relationships. Those are the 4 key elements, and then there's, essentially sub-bullets and that include things like, my favorite is assuming good intentions. I'll assume good intentions when I go into a conversation. So we have that. Again, that's, it's something that all new hires are exposed to. Most of us have it hanging in our offices as well, and we frequently source to it when there is a disconnect. So if someone is falling down on their accountability for something, they didn't follow up or follow through on a commitment they made to you, or if their interactions with you are not modeling that promise of developing and fostering relationships, maybe it's kind of a gossipy, backbiting, a negative environment, then being able to go to a coworker with the promise in hand and say, hey, I feel like the actions that you took on Tuesday when I heard you gossiping about me were not in keeping with the promise. I'd like to kind of look at, what that impact had, and then more importantly, let you know that, it was harmful, and I'd like to see, how we can go from here where we don't have that kind of communication going on. It's not part of our culture, right? So it's supported both on an individual and a company-wide level, and I actually see colleagues leveraging it quite frequently also as a reward. So when we recognize people, we weave that conversation into it too. So that's one thing that I think works really well from a culture perspective. But at the end of the day, it's also really critical to define roles and accountabilities. clearly outlined job descriptions. So there's the how it feels to show up here and work here every day, and there's the simply who's on first, what's happening today, and who's in charge of this project or this, process. So it's really critical to revisit these when there are changes, and there's a lot of shift and change right now and growth. If your job descriptions are moldering somewhere in a vault down in the basement or have layers of dust upon them, great idea to dust them off and really look at who's accountable for what and how is that showing up. Because sometimes you can see, challenges between two highly accountable, focused teammates who are maybe having challenges culturally with each other because there's a question of ownership. Who really truly is responsible for accounts receivable when the duties are being split up across several roles? So a nice job description can kind of iron some of those things out. And then further from there, we need to hire for accountability values. So if we don't bring people in who believe what we believe, that accountability is critical, high trust environments, authenticity, ownership are these key terms that we'd be looking for, then we're not going to be successful. Interestingly, we've seen a rise in requests for culture-based interview questions. That's something we get a lot of requests from clients on, and we've moved from just the pure behavioral, how's your, tell me about a time when you successfully managed a project to, tell me about what it feels like to work with you. I mean, it's the questions we're all wondering, right, as we're interviewing somebody. So this culture-based interview questions is a great search string in Google or Bing or whatever your search sources of record. And then Xenium has a lot of resources around this that get at the bigger topics around culture fit, authenticity, trust, ownership, leadership, things like that. Then we also want to make sure we're supporting our teams with ongoing communication skills training. These are learned skills that need to be reinforced. We all set out to be successful in our jobs. So if I'm falling short and failing you in my performance expectations, likely I don't see it or I'm not aware of it, right? Rarely do I see people see a stop sign and blow right through it willingly. It's usually that they're not aware there's a gap. So in those cases, then, we need our peers, our colleagues, our manager, mentors, and senior leaders to help identify and problem solve around that performance gap. Leaders need to be trained on how to coach for accountability, and the team as a whole needs to be trained on how to flex between different communication styles, problem solve, again, going into these conversations from a place of trust and solutions-oriented conversation, as well as having the ability and the tools to resolve the conflicts. And then, of course, really critically is when things are going well, we've got to practice that recognition and improvement. So when it's going well, reward it. If an employee comes forward with a shining example of high accountability, we need to sing their praises. However they prefer to be recognized, we'll recognize them. Just as critical, though, is to recognize the folks who catch their own missteps and own it. Self-awareness really needs to be encouraged in this process. If it becomes a pattern, then we can address that. If it's, oops, I made another mistake, that's not something to be lauded if it's like the 12th or 13th reiteration of this. But certainly the idea that, we're each accountable for our own success is really critical here. So in summary, we want to create a culture that makes accountability and being accountable as easy as breathing. Right? We want to hold our leaders to the highest standards of accountability and support them in ongoing efforts to maintain that standard. And then we want to hire and reinforce and reward individual employee accountability as well. And I wanted to close with one of my favorite quotes that I think about quite frequently that kind of resonates on this topic. I am who I am today because of the choices I made yesterday. And that starts with that self-accountability. Looking back at, why am I here? How did I get here? And also the accountability for the future. What choices will I make from here that will help me move forward? And now I'll turn it back over to Brandon for some questions.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to keep the screen right here on the resources for 1 second because I think you have some really good book choices and links on here regarding the subject. I wanted to add something to this, though, before we dive into the Q&A. And as I'm kind of talking, I want to invite everybody to enter questions into the chat window, and we'll address those here shortly. Molly, ironically, today we have a book club discussion on a book called How to Say Anything to Anyone
Yep.
by Sherry Harley. And there's some really good parts in the book that really touch on this subject very nicely. And the parts that I love is, setting those agreements with your clients or internal folks up front, like at the beginning of the relationship. So when you veer off in either direction, you can hold each other accountable and it's not super awkward.
Yeah, I agree.
Because if you get too far into the relationship and now all of a sudden you have to provide feedback or just say, hey, you're not being accountable, it's a little bit more awkward. But when you have those upfront agreements,
I agree.
It's a lot easier. So anyways, that book, just there's a lot of accountability based topics in there, and I think it's a good book.
The only reason you're going to call me out in front of 140 people, but the only reason it's not on the resource list is yours truly hasn't finished reading it. I have until 4 o'clock, just for the audience.
There you go.
But I agree. Actually, as I've been reading it, I wanted to incorporate a lot of it, and the topic that you hit on of communication agreements is one that comes up a lot. We have a conflict mediation training that we do quite frequently for managers and supervisors and leads that are in that position of mediating conflicts between employees. And, frequently what we land on, if people aren't able to move forward, is a communication agreement that basically says, this is how it will go and this is how it won't go. And again, whether it's a formal agreement, in paper signed by both parties, or on paper signed by both parties, or more of just an informal agreement, it's that continual commitment that we make that we're moving forward. So that future focus is really critical. A lot of times when we have conflict between folks or a lack of accountability, we spend a lot of time in the history piece of who did what to whom and how bad did it hurt and who's more wounded and what was the impact versus where do we go from here. And sometimes you have to do some of that to figure out where we go from here. But I agree with you that there's a nice, healthy balance between, not just what happened, but more importantly, what can we commit to? That really is at the heart of the accountability conversation as well.
Absolutely. All right, so we'll enter the Q&A portion of this, and again, enter questions in the chat window as we have a few that we'll address here shortly. But as we're talking, just continue to pump out questions. Before we dive into the first one, wanted to restate that we are recording this, so we'll get you the recording and the slides right after the session, probably about a day afterwards. So first question is actually for me, Molly. I gotta selfishly have to get my question in there. So
no worries.
We talk a lot about accountability on one-on-ones with our employees and really that just sort of the private discussions. Yeah. What is your feeling on the social side of it? So I'm thinking like, I'm on the sales and marketing team, and we do a lot of dashboarding. So, we put out our sales numbers and our marketing numbers right out in front of people, and we know what our goals are, but it's for everybody to see.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts, if you're talking about creating a culture of accountability, what are your thoughts on the social aspect of it?
In terms of shared, it's interesting. I've seen it from a wellness perspective too. There's a couple of tools that were really popular where we'd hold each other accountable. I'm thinking about the fact that we had a walking challenge recently, via Fitbit, and many of the Xenium team were both challenging, cheering, and at times taunting each other via Fitbit because of, who had walked more or less in a given day, right? So I think that social pressure piece of it is a very important aspect of it. And I guess I would say I'm for it as long as it doesn't become unhealthy. So it's really easy, especially when we're struggling with accountability, to kind of finger point, place blame, make comments that, will tear away any commitment to accountability that people still have. So I think it's important to remember, we talked about this a lot in our team in terms of thinking about how we handle progressive discipline conversations. There's a statistic that something like 85% of performance problems that employees experience in the workplace relate to directly or are caused by challenges at home. So maybe my marriage is in trouble, or, I'm having a health crisis with myself or a family member, or, Portland's high rent market's threatening my apartment and I'm terrified I'm going to be homeless in a few weeks. I mean, whatever it is, that then plays into the relationships that we have at work and our ability to get our job done because we're thinking about things outside of work. So, I come at this from a place of really believing that people come to work to be successful and to do a good job, and that all kinds of factors can get in the way of that. But we want to make sure that the dialogue that surrounds performance in general, especially from manager to employee, but also on a peer level, is one that's supportive. My experience with a healthy culture is that, you have nothing but support for that kind of thing. So if everybody knows that my goal is to, sell X number of dollars, and we're celebrating, every step of that, every milestone, it can be an incredibly positive effort then as well.
This question comes from Sarah, and I'm going to paraphrase it.
Yeah.
So during the one-on-one meetings, when you're talking about goals, what are the best ways to benchmark where they're at with, and then if they're not there, how do you manage that conversation?
I think that's a great question, Sarah. I think if you're not already using the SMART goal template, SMART is an acronym for, I might get this a little bit wrong, but people have different variations on it, but specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and timely is, I think, the one that I tend to think of. Then you do have timelines tied to those goals. So Molly will create a new webinar for Xenium by the end of the first quarter. And then I think if you have somebody who's struggling with accountability, to Sarah's point, you can break that up into mini goals. So you're going to have your outline done by the beginning of January, or the end of January, let's say, if we're doing an annual goal with a delivery of, second quarter. By mid-February, you should have, 10 out of 20 slides, developed. So you can definitely break that up for people. I think to take a step back, though, Sarah, a really important question would be figuring out from your employee what motivates them and how they want to be managed. At least from an initial perspective, if you don't have a performance breakdown, then really saying, to folks, you have this goal. I want to be as supportive as I possibly can, but truly, you own this. So what works best for you? How much do you want me to check in? What would check-ins look like? And obviously, if there's a gap there in performance expectations, or if there's a history of folks having challenges in those areas, then we probably need to be setting some mini goals to check in as well. But I think really letting employees sort of let you know how much, what kind of a sliding scale of check-in they are looking for and what that would look like can be very helpful too.
The next question comes in from Christopher, and he asks, to create engagement in the workplace, as you mentioned earlier, what are some ways to promote that creativity and innovation to get people excited? And
it's funny, if you had asked me that question a year ago, I probably would have said a really cool hip workspace with no desks, all couches, and no cubicle walls, lots of beer, exactly. There's a real emphasis and a shift right now, and I think it's due to several things that I'll get into in a second here, but around re-examining workspaces and, frankly, company cultures as a result of that. So a lot of us are finding that, an open environment can be really challenging for focus. So if you have a job where you are heads down working on projects throughout the day, and you're in an open work environment where coworkers are chattering or on the phone or, typing away even, it can be very distracting. So some of those really kind of cool, hip culture incentives and engagement pieces we're dialing back on a little bit. There's also a real emphasis. I mentioned millennials. One of the things that they value most is work-life balance. So the ability to take care of aging parents and young kids at the same time can be really challenging. And so you've got, that among several generations. So I think that flexibility piece in terms of, meeting them where they're at and trying to create flexible work environments that also, at least here in the Portland area, will accommodate for traffic and, other challenges that can mean that it's tough for people to arrive, at a set time and sit at a set space, that we're seeing a big shift towards. And then actually one of the things that I'm seeing increasingly used as both team building and then also to kind of foster creativity and spontaneity and ingenuity within teams is team volunteer efforts. So maybe we all knock off work on a Friday at 1 and head over to the Oregon Food Bank and shovel some frozen peas into bags, for folks that, are in need of food. I mean, that kind of thing is a great team building experience, and you'd be surprised how time away from focused work can also help, kind of foster creativity amongst the team as well. Those conversations might still be work related, even though they're happening over the bags of frozen peas. Your brain is working and your blood's flowing and you're moving around. So that's a couple ideas I have.
That's good. Next question comes from Mary, and she asks, during the onboarding process, what is the best way to get across to your employees this is an accountable workplace?
Yeah.
Especially for somebody who's not used to that.
Yeah, well, and especially keeping in mind that 80% of people, when they hear that word accountability, flinch because they think that means that, if I screw up, they're going to fire me,
Yes,
day one. And obviously a new hire doesn't know that coming in, that we're not like that. Hopefully you are not like that, and your culture is not like that, Mary. So I think it really is around fostering this idea that if there is a gap in accountability, if I'm falling down or if you're falling down, then we'll have a conversation about it. It doesn't need to be a big hairy deal, but that, we hold each other accountable at all levels of the organization, not just manager to employee. And then I think really going a step further and, as we do with Xenium, not to toot our own horn, but it's sure been effective, having some kind of a values agreement that supports those conversations and that everybody's committed to living up to, so we commit to having authentic conversations or whatever that looks like for your organization can really be helpful in fostering that for a new hire. But I'll tell you, Mary, you can have the best of intentions and have all of those right conversations in an onboarding, and the minute that, particularly a senior leader is not held accountable or is not personally accountable for something, maybe they were going to deliver something, or maybe there's an inauthentic conversation that starts circulating through the gossip vine, in the workplace, all of that hard work is undone. So I think really focusing on that leadership, walk the walk, not just, we bring people in and we give them this little sheet and they put it up in their cube and they're supposed to be accountable.
Next question comes from Diana. She asks, and I assume she means coaching up, but ideas and suggestions for coaching up senior executives and department managers. So maybe at the employee, hopefully I'm interpreting this right, the employee level, coaching up. Yes.
Yeah. That's a tough one. And without knowing the dynamics of, the specific situation and the relationships, I'm lucky that I tend to work with companies and my own organization, where authentic conversations, especially from a positive, solutions-oriented professional approach, are welcomed at all levels, particularly at a senior level. Then that tends to be my starting point for all conversations. So then it would be, you just go to that person and you let them know that, hey, I felt a little bit off kilter when, you told me that you would have your portion of the report done so I could deliver it to the board on Monday. You said you'd have it done by Wednesday, and I didn't get it until Friday. It meant that I had to work through the weekend, and that was really stressful. A lot of employees would rather die than have that conversation with their manager, but in the right company culture, that kind of thing is welcome, and hopefully there's a true introspective process behind the scenes for leaders wherein, we look at gaps where we ourselves have fallen down. Failing that, and certainly if you feel, at all threatened by, that kind of power relationship between a manager and an employee, and you're trying to coach up, simply introducing them to the concept of accountability, of like, hey, I attended this webinar, it was kind of interesting, it got me thinking about, I wonder if we should have an accountability initiative within the company. And it kind of starts from a broader basis, and at some point people are kind of looking at themselves internally, but to me, that's a little bit less direct than being able to go to somebody and say, here was the gap, and I'm concerned. And I'm not blaming, I'm just looking for a solution because, I want to do a good job for you. And I felt like because I was rushed over the weekend, it was maybe not my best effort in front of the board.
A question from Roy. He asks, have you seen if there's been greater success around accountability in heavily metric-driven environments?
Oh, Roy.
I like
oh, my goodness.
Good job, Roy.
It's a total Brandon question.
Yes.
I'm beginning to believe that Roy is actually Brandon.
Yeah, right. We're the same person.
I will go back to, the environment I know best, which is my own. And I will tell you, Roy, that I am not a numbers person, and that for me, accountability has improved personally when I have had the ability to look at my work from a time-based, metrics-driven software platform. So we have a CRM, a customer relations manager, where we track all of our meetings and our work and our projects that we do for our clients. And it's supposed to basically give us information around client utilization and our own utilization. I use that puppy for time management. I use it for personal accountability. I mean, really making sure that I'm spending my time well. So, I mean, normally I would be kind of averse to managing accountability through metrics, but if it's done well and not from an approach of, the metrics are all that matters and you'll be punished if you're falling short of the metrics, then I would have a concern around that. So we don't want it to become a punitive, approach, but it sure helps people benchmark. And the same is true when I train, or if I've attended time management seminars. We often have a really skewed view of what we're spending our time on. And I think, that relates to accountability. A lot of this is time management and being able to do the right work at the right time. So I think the data could be helpful, but, please don't ever tell Brandon that I actually admitted to that. So you close your ears over there.
Suzanne's going to test your accountability skills here.
Oh, dear.
She asked, how do you address accountability conversations and agreements in multilingual, multicultural work environment?
Multilingual, multicultural environments. Okay. I think I'm going to take the easy out on this one, Suzanne, and say it would be really critical to understand what those cultures are. I mean, you're right, both from a nationality, a language, a regionality perspective, and then certainly company by company. There's different kind of structures around accountability. And, my sense is that it would be first coming from an understanding of what that unique environment looks like. And then I think you'd have to at some point, especially if you're dealing with a large multinational firm where you've got employees that are working across time zones typically, and certainly across, borders with each other. There needs to be an agreement, kind of the communication agreement or productivity agreement, whatever you want to call it, that basically when we say we're going to do this, we deliver upon it. But you're fighting some really, really deep culture pieces there that, there are some cultures that, again, how we address any kind of problem, in a working relationship really varies depending on, the culture. So there's actually some great trainings. We have partnered in the past with a great company called Pacific Dreams that does a lot of work around this kind of differences in how cultures and regions of the world address, challenges and opportunities, and even converse with one another. So that might be a good resource for you as well, too.
We have time for probably two more questions, but if you still have questions, keep throwing them in there. Molly will spend all day answering your questions. I'm just kidding, Molly.
Now I'm accountable.
Yeah,
so.
Well, absolutely. I just threw it out there, the social pressure.
That's right.
Vicky asked, and I'm going to actually paraphrase this a little bit. So if a group has goals and is accountable to those overarching goals, but individuals on that team don't necessarily have the same priority or maybe have some slightly different goals based on their responsibilities, how do you handle that?
I think it has to come from a leadership level. So at that point, you've got a leader who may not be clear on their responsibilities, the team's responsibilities, and what the end goal is, what the company needs, basically, to move us forward. So there needs to be kind of a reckoning at that level where we can come back to say, this is the main focus. Now, we all know that everybody has their own individual styles and preferences. So if it's something, where we actually are aligned on goals, we should all be working on X project, and Cindy Lou Who over here doesn't choose to, follow that edict and doesn't want to be a part of that team, collaboration, then that is a one-off conversation. I was just talking about this with a coworker the other day. I can't tell you how many times I'm brought in to train a group of employees around, let's say, customer service, where there is one employee who is failing in customer service. The other 8 are doing a fabulous job, and we're all here because of Cindy Lou Who, and her failure to provide excellent customer service. So from an accountability perspective, same thing. I mean, if we're all, marching along towards one goal and the team is pulling itself, along towards that goal and working hard, and we've got one person who's going off or two people who are going off in another direction, I feel like that should start with an individual conversation versus hey, we all need to be more accountable. Unless they're operating under somebody, some other direction from a senior leader, we should be pulling along in the same direction. That's incredibly damaging, honestly, to a team and to relationships if we have, people that are basically pulling in the opposite direction.
Michelle asks, how do you build a positive, trustworthy relationship between managers and employees?
Oh, Michelle. We could be another hour on that.
Question,
yeah. I'm going to take a really easy out on this one because of time constraints, and that is it absolutely has to start with managers being trustworthy. I mean, again, when you're in a position of leadership and authority, with great power comes great responsibility. So we've got to have people that are trustworthy in and of themselves, and then they have to be willing to spend their time with people. And that's hard. A lot of our managers are working managers where they're performing an 8-hour day, unrelated to managing the team, giving performance evaluations, coaching on performance, growing and developing team members. But one-on-ones can be an incredibly effective way for that to happen, where managers and employees, we recommend monthly, are sitting down for an hour to talk about, what challenges the employee has, what their successes are, and more importantly, how the manager can help support them, what they need. And when that kind of frequency happens, trust grows and develops within those teams. It makes it a lot less stressful for me to go to my manager and trust them with, feedback if our process is breaking down. If I see them every month at a Starbucks for an hour a day and we talk about how things are going, I mean, there's a relationship there. I don't only see them when there's a problem, So I think the relationship building, and then again, kind of backing up a step and saying, as leaders, we need to be someone who is accountable. We need to be someone who is trustworthy. We need to walk that walk. And when we fail, which we do at times, we need to have, a self-accountability conversation and maybe even admit that to our coworkers and say, guys, I've been falling down behind on emails. I'm sorry. I've got, an issue with this or that. I'm going to resolve it, and I appreciate your patience and flexibility with me, but, my standard is a lot higher for myself, and here's how I plan to achieve it. We don't necessarily owe that conversation to every single employee, but, our peer group, and certainly if somebody has seen a gap there, then those folks, should really be part of the solution as well.
Amazing questions. We did it. I want to direct everybody to the resources that we have. So on the Xenium blog, tons of news, articles, content, white papers, free content, all that's there. I also want to, if you love the distance learning thing, like webinars, we do webinars about every month or two, but podcasts we do about 1 to 3 times a month. I kind of play interviewer, interview some authors, some internal people. Best way to get those are on iTunes. You can also get them on our blog if you want to read the transcript, whatever's easier for you, but iTunes is probably the best way to subscribe to the podcast. And then if you need to reach out to Molly, she's at molly.kelley@xeniumhr.com, and you can reach out to me, brandon.laws@xeniumhr.com. We're on LinkedIn, probably Twitter. I don't know about Molly if she's on Twitter, but
no, I'm a dinosaur, but
she's a dinosaur.
I don't tweet.
I'm on Twitter, so feel free to connect with me. And then if you want to get your HRCI credit, we're offering 1 credit for this webinar. Email me directly, and I'll get you a certificate. We'll send the recording, and we'll send out a survey, and if you would take the survey and let us know how we're doing and tell us about future topics you want to hear, and that will fuel our future webinars. So thank you for attending. Thank you for the awesome questions, Molly.
Thank you so
much.
Awesome
job
you
today.
guys.
Really appreciate it.
Have a great high accountability day.
Love it.